Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln S. Farish here, with my trusty peace pipe tomahawk. There are three major concepts within civil affairs you really need to understand. That's legitimacy, governance, and stability. Within that framework and the understanding of it is a lot of what we do and how we do it. So understanding it at a very fundamental level will help you through CAQC, will help you on deployments, will help you generally with your time in the military as a civil affairs officer. However, remember, these are my thoughts. Not endorsed by the U.S. Army, US CAPOC, or SWCC. Let's talk sovereignty. All right, so sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern itself. Sovereignty deals with who is in charge and who owns what. It's a physical reality as well as a socio-political construct. And how exactly individual states do this becomes a very delicate question. All right, so in political theory, sovereignty is a substantive term. Substantive meaning having a separate and independent existence. Substantive law refers to the laws which establish principles and creates and defines the rights and limitations under which a society is governed. Sovereignty is a substantive term designating supreme legitimate authority over some polity. That's a group of people within a bounded area. In international law, sovereignty is the exercise of power by a state. You have two types. You have de jure sovereignty, which refers to the legal right to do so, usually referring to other countries recognize the existence of the state. And the de jure sovereignty is an ability that other countries agree with, say setting a tax rate. And again, you're a recognized entity. Now you have de facto sovereignty, and this refers to the factual ability of a group of people within a bounded area to exercise political power, say creating a passport and stuff like that, which usually causes all kinds of problems. So it's an ability that other countries may not agree with, but tolerate for now. All right, so we've got about 2,000 years of history when it talks to sovereignty. This is a concept that's been way back, starting with the Roman times, so I'm going to have to go fast and light over this. So in the beginning, a long time ago, it was the individual or group of people who possessed land via the right of conquest. This is mine because I can kill anyone who says differently. Authority and power are one. One possesses the land, as in they get to decide who can and cannot use the land or traverse through it, or fish in the streams or hunt in the woods, and so on. Now, ownership is different than possession, in that ownership is a legal construct and requires a superordinate authority who has the ability to determine the legitimacy of claims and the power to enforce that decision. Now, you can still find possession of land in practice with, say, a tribal-based region, a failed or failing state. Civil wars are all about who possesses which piece of territory, and underneath that, who owns which house or which farm. You also have possession when it comes to criminal organizations. The gang possesses this street corner and sells drugs. Obviously, not an activity endorsed by the state, but the willingness to use violence to maintain their claim on that street corner gives them possession. However, not actual legal ownership. Now, so as groups got bigger, we formed the city-state. And to minimize the bloodshed who owned what possession, ownership became codified by law. In the West, the first really good example of this is the Roman law precedent uti possessidis. As you possess, so shall you possess. And the concept was adapted at higher levels. Clan Julia can now own land because Rome will protect their right to own that land, but Rome possesses land only because they can occupy it and through violence maintain their claim. Fast forward a bit and you get to 494, almost year 500, and Pope Gelasius develops the two-sword doctrine, kind of defining what are the spiritual role and what is the secular temporal role of the sovereign and of the church. And it's an articulation of who's wielding what authority, helping define the different types of authority and who's in charge of what. So the church is in charge of spiritual authority, the sovereign is in charge of secular temporal authority. Now, this principle underlies all Western European political thought for almost a millennium. And the letter played a significant role in the development of the legal doctrine of sovereign immunity, which remains in force in international politics to this day. So possession is now more than just power. God, through the church, says it is right and just that I rule over these land and people. which is how we get the concept of the divine right of kings. This also is the beginnings of legitimacy and sovereignty. So at the city-state level and between city-states, it's still possession, as there's no higher government. But as city-states merged into the current nation-state construct we have today, the issue continues. France possesses land on this side of the border, Belgium possesses land on that side of the border. However, both France and Belgium can decide ownership within their own territory. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30-Year War and established the inviolability of borders and non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states, more or less. All right, so beginnings of sovereignty as codified, Treaty of Westphalia says there's an inviolability of borders and that there should be no domestic interference by outside nation states. And Thomas Hobbes goes a little further in Leviathan. We'll see why it's important here in a moment. And he gives his thoughts on sovereignty. It's got to be absolute and indivisible. If the sovereign doesn't have absolute authority, if there's someone above them, then he's not actually sovereign. If you can be overruled, then you're not the final decision maker. And it's got to be indivisible, meaning only one person or conceptually one group makes a decision. Because if you had two kings or a committee with an even number of people, you could end up being unable to render a decision because of competing interests. Now, Hobbes had a hypothesis. If and when the ruler fails, the people recover their ability to protect themselves by forming a new contract. All right, so Jean-Jacques Rousseau went a little bit further. He was a French philosopher. Now, he said the sovereign can only act through law, not an absolute authority as was described earlier. And the law is the decision of the general will of the people in some common interest. And all the sovereign is doing is enforcing the general will of the people. And the legislature and the legislator don't have any authority in themselves other than to help craft and guide laws that are desired by the general populace. And the reason this is important is the U.S. Constitution uses this approach where the people have the power, the legislature crafts laws for the common interest of the people, and the executive branch, the president, through the executive branch, enforces those laws. It's the basis of the U.S. Constitution. It's the basis of what we call good governance. All right, so how do you know someone or something is sovereign? So the basic rule of thumb, if no one can tax you, if no one can seize your lands through eminent domain, and no one compels you to send tribute to them, you're sovereign. Right, so why do we care about sovereignty? And the reason, it's an important concept because sovereignty is property rights in politics. It defines what is or is not owned by a polity. It establishes borders, defines who owns and who can exploit resources, fishing, forest, mining. How far out does the border go, and will the polity enforce that border? Can they enforce that border? It helps identify who belongs to a group and who does not. It allows the development of diplomatic relations, allows for the creation of treaties, the creation of subsidiary borders, cities within a nation state, and allows legitimate taxation. However, there's some problems. All right, like all philosophies, there's some issues. Not everyone follows Western practices. Can sovereignty be lost? Who decides if an entity is sovereign? Because you have two types. You have de jure and de facto. And could a political entity not be sovereign in theory? And the answer is no. The way it was constructed everywhere on Earth is there's a sovereign in charge of it. In actuality, it's a lot stickier. So, some further issues. Not everyone agrees with Rousseau's theory that the people have the power. They cede some of that power to the executive branch, and the legislature is there to craft laws to protect the common good. Not everyone agrees to that, even in the West, let alone the rest of the world. So you've got actual situations you're going to deal with. What about a tribal entity? You've got a group of people that are in possession of land. They are making decisions that normally would be reserved for a higher entity. If it's not a legitimate claim, how do you deal with that? What about ungoverned lands? Is there such thing as an ungoverned land? Disputed territories. In the middle of a civil war, who is sovereign over a particular piece of land? What about failed and failing states? Can they lose their sovereignty? These are all things that you need to understand and be prepared to deal with to help the commander achieve his end goals. All right, so I've got an example here from U.S. history. In 1809, William Henry Harrison, before he was president, obtained about 30 million acres of American Indian land for the white settlers of Illinois and Indiana. Now, the negotiations primarily involved the Delaware tribe who originally lived around the Delaware River near Philadelphia, who had sold land to the U.S. and moved, occupying land in the Midwest. All right, so they were originally around Philadelphia, had sold off what they owned or possessed to the U.S. government, and had moved out to the Midwest. And now, again, we're in possession of the land, and we're again selling it. Now, the Shawnee, different tribe who lived in the same area, were not included in these negotiations, and were a little bit irritated by this. And this led to Tecumseh's War. Now, the land technically was formerly held by the British, ceded after the Revolutionary War, but not everyone agreed, obviously. And again, you had differences between possession and ownership. So, could the Delaware tribe sell land they occupied? And if they couldn't, then how do you deal with possession or ownership of that land? It is simply the right of conquest. And what about the Shawnee? Could the Shawnee object to a different tribe selling land that the Shawnee didn't occupy? Okay, so way back when we first started off, the Lenape, apology if I mispronounced that, the Delaware Indians were in and around Philadelphia. They eventually moved out to Indiana, Illinois area. And if you look at the pink there on the left-hand side, that's the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809, the little triangles there. All right, so how did the Delaware get from Philadelphia to Fort Wayne? Obviously, they walked, and it probably took them months, if not longer, to uproot the tribe and go out to Fort Wayne and occupy land. Again, they possessed the land because they held it through right of conquest, not because there was a superordinate authority that provided them ownership. So the question becomes, did the Delaware have a legitimate claim to ownership of this land because they possessed it? Could the Shawnee object to the Delaware possessing land that the Delaware had? Could the Delaware sell the land to the U.S.? And if so, by selling land to the U.S., were the Delaware then seen as sovereign? All good questions. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. That's sovereignty. Again, a concept you really need to be able to master so that you understand the how and why when you're out there in the field. As always, book recommendation, Social Order of the Underworld, How Prison Gangs Govern the American Penal System by David Scarbeck, I think. All right, good primer to understand at the subnational level how governance and sovereignty works, possession versus ownership. And I think it'll be helpful because if you understand one, making the transition to a different system with a different group of people will be easier than going in blind. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.